Hello everyone, and welcome to Sci-Fi Christian. I am Ben DiBono, or perhaps I should say, welcome to hell, because this is week 2 of our Dante reading, and we are right in the thick of it. By this point, if you are following along with the reading plan, which I will try to remember to put into the video description right below where you're watching this, you should be through Canto 11 of the Inferno, which is going to take you through Circle 6. Now, if you're thinking that we're moving through the circles pretty fast, you're correct. Dante does move through certainly the first 4 or 5 circles almost at a blazing fast speed. But once we get down to circles 7, 8, and 9, especially 8, we will slow down quite a bit. As those circles, not only does Dante take more time for them, but they also kind of have circles within circles. You know, that's where the really bad people go, you know, down there. But we'll get to all that in good time. To start off this week, I wanted to throw out a trivia question that I posted on the Sci-Fi Christian Facebook page. And I'll give you the question now and give you the answer at the end of the video. Which, of course, if all you want is the answer, you go ahead and flip right to the end of the video. But I'm going to wait a while to give the answer just because I know not everybody's on the Sci-Fi Christian Facebook page, though you should be, and might not have seen this question. So the question I asked was J.R.R. Tolkien, huge fan of medieval literature, you know, ancient texts, mythology, all this good stuff, influenced by tons of those sources in writing The Lord of the Rings and his other works. And the Divine Comedy is no exception. It too was an influence for him. He's a member of the Dante Society at Oxford for a number of years. He mentions in his letters that he and C.S. Lewis would at times get together and read sections of the Divine Comedy out loud to one another. I mean, you know, who wouldn't want to be present for that social gathering, right? So the question that I had is that in the sections that we read today, which would be Cantos 4, starting at Limbo, through Canto 11, Circle 6, I see at least 2 things that Tolkien takes and from this section and incorporates them into The Lord of the Rings. One being a location and one being an event. So you can ponder that while we do the video today, and I'll give you the answer at the end. All right, so let's start off with a little recap. We'll go a bit faster than last week since we have more ground to cover here. First of all, we are now into hell proper. We have passed the vestibule of hell with the people chasing the banner. You know, when we last met Dante, he had fallen over in a faint, but now he's back on his feet and he's in hell itself, though it doesn't seem like it. Why? Because Circle 1, which is Limbo, is actually a pretty pleasant place. Circle 1 is where we find the noble pagans, those who didn't really sin or didn't have very sinful lives, but died without faith, died without baptism in particular, and so here they are. So we're going to meet people like Homer and Aristotle, you know, it's the big one who the Virgil and Dante run into at the Citadel of Reason and everything. Virgil himself lets us know that he was that this is his permanent location, and the only punishment that these people have here in Limbo is a lack of hope. They have no hope of heaven. Otherwise, life is pretty great. You know, you get to hang out with Homer and Aristotle and Plato and all these guys for your whole life. You could do worse for eternity than that. You could do much worse, as we'll find in the next 8 circles. But, you know, all in all, it's not too bad. The interesting thing here, though, and I want to make sure I point this out, is that you'll notice at the end of this canto that Dante, you know, asks Virgil, has anybody ever gotten out of here? And we get our first reference to the harrowing of hell. You know, when Christ, the moment in Christian theology or Christian mythology, depending on exactly where we want to place that and how we interpret some verses in Scripture, where Christ, in between his death and resurrection, descends into hell and lets the prisoners free. And we found out that he let Moses and Adam and Eve and Rachel and Abraham and all these, great Old Testament saints were in limbo before, and Christ lets them free. We will see throughout our journey to hell references to the harrowing of hell. And I will say a bit more about that in the next section. Okay, so limbo, great place. Then we move on to the lustful that are in circle 2. And this is where things get a little bit rough. And as I pointed out before, every sin in the Inferno is represented outwardly by what that sin is inwardly. So here, lust, Dante envisions that as blowing the spirits of the lustful uncontrollably here and there. Essentially they are out of control of themselves, and that's depicted by the lustful in circle 2 being blown about by this giant wind. Kind of a rough go. But it's going to get worse. Then, we had passed over Minos, so we have to talk about him, who in between Limbo and Circle 2. So if you don't get sent to Limbo, before you get sent down to whichever circle you belong in, you get judged by the great monster or creature from Greek mythology, Minos, who hears your sins, he takes your confession, and then sends you down to whatever circle you are, the first of the many monsters we'll meet along the way. The next monster, though, is Cerberus, the great three-headed dog who we meet in Circle 3 with the Gluttons. And the Gluttons are in pretty rough shape. They're essentially, you kind of have this snowy rain mixture falling from the sky, but it definitely seems worse than that, because Dante also describes it as having this kind of intolerable stench. So really, they're just sitting in filth, and he describes them how, not only is Cerberus the dog there, but almost the Gluttons themselves have become animal-like, that they turn one way or the other trying to shield themselves with their own bodies, and they're just incredibly pathetic individuals down there. And we meet Chiaccio the Hog, who is a figure from Florence in Dante's time. Yes, you'll notice that Dante meets many people from Florentine. There's a whole subtext throughout the Inferno about Florentine politics. We probably won't get into that very much in these videos, but it's worthwhile knowing it's there, and people like Chiaccio are part of it. Next we get the greedy in Circle 4, but it's greed in two ways. It's the greed of waste and then the greed of hoarding. So you ever watch the reality show Hoarders? That's where all these people are going. And essentially, so you got your two teams, those who are wasteful and those who are hoarders, and they each push these kind of big stones. They roll them off these hills and then they clash into each other and they fight together, and it's quite violent and horrible. Then we get the greedy, or not the greedy, excuse me, the wrathful. And the wrathful kind of have a sub-sin in here called the sullen. So you have people who kind of have this boiling over explosive rage, but then in the tradition of my fellow Midwesterners and myself, of course, for all of us who are in the Midwest, we're famous for our passive-aggressive natures. And we are represented here as well as the sullen, the people who have that rage, but we'll be damned if we're going to let it out, and are darned if we're going to let it out, so the wrathful are on the surface of this swamp, tearing at each other and devouring one another, essentially. Well, the sullen are, represented by, essentially, they're sunk to the bottom and they're bubbling up underneath. It's just a wonderful image. We hit the river Styx, and Filet, how do you say this guy's name again? I'm probably going to butcher many of these, but Pelagius, whatever, that he gets signaled, he helps them cross the river of Styx, and the marsh and everything, and we come to the city of Dis, where the gate is shut. So Dis being the capital of hell, essentially. The poets can't get through. They have to summon help from above. In the meantime, they are attacked by Medusa and the Gorgons and the Furies and everything, and it's quite a wonderful scenario, and I'll say more about that in just a little bit. They wind up getting through the gate because the angel comes down, taps it with his little wand, as some translations put it, and they are into lower hell, where we meet the heretics, who are being burned alive for all eternity in their tombs. Now, for those of you keeping score at home, you'll notice that this really is the first time that fire has showed up in hell. Now, fire is actually very, very rare in Dante's hell. Dante reserves it for those whose offense is more directly a slap in the face to God. So we see it here with the heretics, people who pervert God's truth. In particular, Dante seems concerned with heretics who deny the immortality of the soul. And then we also see it in Circle 7, the third round of Circle 7. Circle 7 is about violence. And there's first round is people who are violent to themselves, second is violent to others, and then the third is violent to God, and fire shows up there as well, and we will see that next time. Then we kind of make our way through the heretics, and it smells really bad, so Dante and Virgil pause, and while they're paused, Virgil kind of gives Dante the lowdown of how hell is divided. We find out that it is divided according to three sins: the incontinent, who are, up at the top, people out of control and everything, then the malice, and then those who are bestial, the three sins of incontinence, malice, and bestiality, which, just to be very clear, that last one is not its more perverse modern form, but more literally forfeiting your humanity so that you become essentially like an animal. So up till this point, we've been dealing with the incontinent and kind of transitioning into the malice, and we will keep on going down. All right, a couple of things to realize here as far as symbols go in this section. I mentioned the harrowing of hell that we see definitely at the top. John Ciardi, or Ciardi, however you pronounce his last name, seems to think that there's another reference to the harrowing of hell at the beginning of Canto 11, where you see the boulders are smashed, that kind of, there's this place of crumbled rocks and everything. That's certainly possible. You might have read his note on that if you're reading his edition. I haven't found references to other commentators saying that. I'm not saying there aren't. I'm by no means extremely well read in Dante's scholarship. I just know that the other annotated editions I have, and Dante Worlds, which is the companion volume I've recommended, don't make a mention to that, but it's certainly possible. But whether or not that reference in Canto 11 is part of the harrowing of hell, Dante does want us to realize that hell is not something out of control. It's not something out of God's control. That God is there, and even God's grace and the breaking of hell is there very much throughout. Now, Dante's very careful about how he does this. And I don't know if John Ciardi mentions this in his notes or not, but Jesus, God, the Virgin Mary, none of them are ever named by name in the Inferno. They're always referred to euphemistically, as one, or the one who is blessed is the way he'll refer to the Virgin Mary sometimes, or one who came here before is often the something along those lines as the reference to the harrowing of hell. And so Dante is careful to realize that, we are, in some way, there is a division between us and God in the Inferno, but yet he's still here, and his grace is still here, and that's a very powerful sense. The other thing to maybe that's very powerful symbolically in this section is the whole fight outside of the city of Dis at the wall, where Dante and Virgil show up. You have all the fallen angels there guarding, 1,000 of them, we're told, are guarding the city gate. And for the first time thus far, Virgil is stumped. He can't get through. And so they have to kind of, get on the bat phone and call upstairs and have somebody come down and help them. Things get very bad at this point. We have a very exciting scene if you're looking for a little more action in the Inferno, where the Furies show up and Medusa shows up, and Virgil basically says to Dante, hey, if you look at them, just like in Greek mythology, you look at the Medusa, you turn to stone, it's going to be really bad. I can't do anything about that if that happens. So not only does he make Dante close his eyes, he kind of, does that deal to him too. He holds his hands over his eyes. And we get this very tense scene where the demons of hell and these monsters are closing in. And then up out of the water comes this angel, and he's just annoyed. And he walks up with his little wand and touches the gate, and it's all over. Okay, to really understand this scene, though, as anything more than just an exciting, tense action moment, which it certainly works well as, you have to understand the symbolism going on here. That Virgil symbolizes human reason, and Dante wants us to understand that human reason has limits. That human reason ultimately is powerless in the face of this kind of evil. It can kind of huddle in the corner and protect itself from evil, but it's powerless to get through it. It's powerless to overcome it. That's a very important point for Dante. That human reason has its limits. But what doesn't have its limits is grace. And so when by grace, yet again, we see grace present in the midst of hell, the angel shows up, there's no tension at that point. It's almost anticlimactic, and intentionally so, where he walks up with his little wand and he's just annoyed. Like, I love the way that Dante writes his dialogue there, where he's just like, "What are you doing? You guys are idiots. You've already pissed off God enough. Come on." He's just contemptuous of the demons and of the Furies and everything. And it's such a wonderful scene theologically for what Dante is trying to say. That, look, this journey is going to require more than reason. It requires grace. And grace is very much present throughout the Inferno and throughout the Divine Comedy as a whole. And that kind of brings me to the reflection I wanted to give us as far as Lent goes from this section. Because what really struck me was not only this great scene outside the Wall of Dis, but I think in some ways that scene is connected to some encounters in Limbo. Where, like I said before, Limbo's not a bad place. And even Dante does pretty well there. Like, it's... He has the 5 great poets walk up to him. There's Homer and Ovid and a couple others whose names are escaping me, and Virgil, and they welcome him into their midst. It's like, "Hey, you're one of us, dude. Come on, join the club," And Dante doesn't get into the psychology of this so much, but if you think about that scene, as far as what you would feel or I would feel in that case, like, that's a pretty affirming thing. Think of whatever your field is, or whatever your passions are. Think of the 5 greatest people in that field, or the 5 people you admire the most in history or in your life or whatever, basically saying, "Hey, you're part of the club, and it's just the 6 of us." The temptation to stay there is, of course, overwhelming. And it's almost a very tragic moment if you think of it. I don't think it's so much Dante patting himself on the back as it is to say that, look, this might be good, but what's tragic about it is that you can get that far on your own. Limbo is the place of human reason. Limbo is as far as human reason gets you. And it's a good place, but you're still in hell. And that's a very chilling thought if you think about it, because I feel like part of what Dante is trying to remind us there, and what I want to remind us as part of this Lenten reflection here at the end of this second video, is that you can do all right on your own in this life. And that's horrifying when you think about it, because ultimately we are in need of God's grace. And if we want to go further, if we want to use the Divine Comedy as our analogy, get through hell, get through purgatory, and reach the beatific vision, ultimately at the end of Paradiso, we have to step beyond ourselves and accept the grace that is waiting for us. And the great temptation there, of course, though, is that accepting that grace requires us to take the next step out of circle 1 into circle 2 and beyond, and all these horrible, horrible things we're going, that Dante experiences, and even purgatory as we get there. Certainly no cakewalk itself. But it's grace that enables us to take that step. And I think, though, that this is a temptation even as we do something like Lent, that the pressure gets on to, I have to make myself have a good Lent and all that. And Lent is, we don't do the things we do in Lent, whether it's reading the Divine Comedy or giving something up or almsgiving or, whatever it is. We don't do those things to try and change ourselves. We do them to open ourselves up to God's transformation. Of course, I'm coming at this from a Catholic perspective, where I see good works working very much hand in hand with God's grace. But I think even from a more traditional Protestant perspective, that's absolutely true. That the temptation's always there to do things outside of God's grace. But rather, we're invited in Lent to take this posture of submitting our good works, our actions, however you want to think of them, to God, so that He can ultimately transform us. And yes, sometimes that requires us, God's grace is such that it comes to us in a way that says walk through hell, as we talked about some last time. So that would be my reflection then for this week, is to encourage us as we go forward in Lent to rely not on our human reason, to not stop where it feels good enough, but to be able to take the next step beyond where it feels good into hell, so that by God's grace we ultimately are transformed to a place where we not only have a good Lent, but are prepared to ultimately reach, as Dante does, the beatific vision. All right, so that's my thoughts for this week. For next week, read through Canto 22, which is going to take us through the fifth pit, I forget what they're called when we get to Circle 5. Malabulges, evil pouches, I think is what my notes, I found some cool notes, a cool little map of Inferno online. So through Canto 22 will take you halfway through, it'll be right about halfway through Circle 8, and then the week after that we'll finish up the Inferno. So 11 cantos for this next week. I know it's a lot of reading, but if you're falling behind, don't stress it. You can read at your own pace. It's better to do this in a way that works for you than to necessarily try to keep to a schedule. Though, of course, I would encourage you to keep to the schedule, because it's always, it's never fun to fall behind when you're reading something with other people. All right, then. Enough about that. So through Canto 22 by next week. How about Tolkien? What am I seeing in this section that we read for this week that Tolkien draws from? Well, there's two things. One I'm very sure about, and one I'm pretty sure about. Of course, Tolkien didn't ever annotate his stuff to go through and say, I took this from here, and this from here, and this from here. But nevertheless, I think we can make some very educated guesses, if not outright notice some outright parallels. The first one would be the Citadel of Reason in Limbo in Canto 4, which is described as having 7 different gates, all ascending up to a citadel at the top. Now, for you Tolkienites, what place in Middle-earth does that remind you of? Well, it's Minas Tirith, of course. Minas Tirith has 7 different gates, each ascending up to a citadel. And even the symbolism works well here, that, the Citadel of Reason is the height of humanity as humanity. And that's very much what Minas Tirith is as well. It's not the kind of divine, grace-filled locations that the elves build in Middle-earth, but it is the height of human reason as human reason. So it works quite well. The second one that I see, that's maybe a little bit more questionable, but I'm convinced myself, is when they get to the River Styx, and I'm going to butcher this guy's name again, Pelagius, he comes rowing across to ferry them over the River Styx. What happens? Well, there's 2 towers, if you will, not the 2 towers from Lord of the Rings, but there's 2 towers, one on each side of the bank, and they signal to each other. Where do you see that in Lord of the Rings? Well, to me, that's almost exactly what happens when Minas Morgul and Cirith Ungol, I believe it is prepared to send the orc armies off to fight Minas Tirith. I believe we see it through Sam and Frodo's eyes, and they're part of the journey where the two towers signal to each other. It's depicted in the movie as well, where Gandalf and Pippin see it from off in a distance, to send the troops out. Only reason I think it's a little bit questionable is because it's on a much smaller scale here. These aren't towers as big as, Minas Morgul, but still, I think it's convinced. I think even, you could say Dante talks about there being lights in one of the towers, and the lights in the towers describe very similar to how Tolkien describes the lights at the top of Cirith Ungol. So, I, for one, think that is a reference as well. And no doubt there might well be others that I have missed. But that's, of course, a fun game you can play with Tolkien, is trying to figure out where he drew his so many different sources from and where he drew this or that from. And if you read a lot of ancient or classical literature, the more you'll read, the more you'll find that hey, that kind of reminds me of something Tolkien might have written in Lord of the Rings or Silmarillion or all that. So, a nice fun game to play along the way as you read these great books. All right, that's it for me then for this week. Through Canto 22 next time, and I will talk to you then. Goodbye.